The ongoing crisis on the southern border and the associated challenges facing U.S. Customs and Border Protection and their various partners to the south highlights the importance of re-examining our approach to the Western Hemisphere security and perhaps developing a more comprehensive approach to the region. The impact of these challenges on both U.S. national security and the national security and domestic politics of our partner nations elsewhere in the hemisphere has been substantial. The 2.4 million encounters CBP recently reported for FY22 highlights the scale of this challenge. How can policy and technology be leveraged to secure the Western Hemisphere? Our next panel, moderated by former CBP Commissioner and Acting DHS Secretary Kevin McAleenan, explores these issues.
Good morning. Good to be back with such an incredible group of Homeland Security professionals. Just want to add my thanks, as many speakers have, to Secretary Chertoff, to Congresswoman Harman, to Rob Walker for bringing this group together. It always feels a bit like homecoming for me, so really enjoy it. And I've been impressed, as usual, with the quality of the dialogue, but more importantly, the quality of the people. And the panel we have this morning, I'm going to predict, will be no exception. I can guarantee you on the people side. Brief scene setter. The topic is securing the Western Hemisphere through policy and technology. So we can talk about whatever we want up here. That is a very broad topic. But I'll just make a couple observations up front. Even though the Western Hemisphere is, of course, our neighborhood, our largest trading partners, and in my view, the number one way that our Homeland Security is impacted, and we'll talk about some of those flows, it really doesn't get the attention it deserves from our security apparatus or our foreign policy community, in my view. And the dynamics in this region directly impact our border, directly impact Americans in all 50 states, as we just heard from the last panel. But it doesn't get that global focus that I think it needs. And the Homeland Security enterprise can lead that way and lead that discussion. Today, the dynamics are characterized by two main and unprecedented phenomena. And I say they're unprecedented not because this is the first year we've had these challenges in our regional security, but because they've reached levels that we haven't seen before. First, of migrants coming throughout the region and beyond to our border, and second, deadly volumes of synthetic opioids, specifically fentanyl and its variants. To put those two statements in context, CBP encountered 2.3 million migrants at the border in fiscal year 22, which just ended. That is an astonishing number. This is by far the highest level ever recorded. We never even hit 1 million in the prior decade, to put that in context, 2.3. And for the first time, a plurality of arrivals are coming from further away than Mexico and Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, over 150 countries. In addition to creating a massive humanitarian challenge, there are security impacts throughout the region, from the sending countries, the transit countries, and the human toll is really catastrophic. There were 800 deaths, over 800 deaths at the U.S. border alone in this journey. Imagine what's happened throughout the process getting to our border over the last year. Fentanyl seizures are also at a record level, 5 times a record that we achieved just a few years ago in 2019, contributing to over 100,000 deaths in the United States. And of course, both of these flows enrich transnational criminal organizations, the most violent criminals in the world, to the tune of tens of billions of dollars, contributing to a vicious cycle of violence, difficulty in governance, and corruption throughout the region. We've got some other challenges too. Political upheaval and transition in many countries of the region in the Western Hemisphere, fallout from the continuing challenges in Venezuela, increasing influence from China and others in our backyard, governance issues, and slowing economies. So I would say we have a lot to deal with, but we have the right panel to talk through it and hopefully identify some ways that policy and technology and this broader Homeland Security enterprise community can help. So if I could quickly introduce my panel. Ambassador Alfonso Quinones, the Ambassador of Guatemala to the United States, long and distinguished diplomatic career, business career with international organizations. He's an incredible representative for the government of Guatemala, and I think you'll enjoy hearing from him today. Jonathan Fleming, former TSA Assistant Administrator. We got to give your Homeland Security credentials for all of you first, as well as President and CEO of S2 Global. Teresa Cardinal Brown, Bipartisan Policy Center, former policy leader at DHS, who we all know well in this space. And of course, Dr. Gary Schiffman, former Chief of Staff at CBP and the CEO of Giant Oak. So please give a warm welcome to our panel today. Ambassador, I'm going to start with you. We often start our dialogues from a U.S. perspective looking south. I think it would be beneficial to hear a Guatemalan perspective right in the middle of these challenges that I outlined.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for the invitation. And I think that this is very important because things that happen in our countries impact the United States. And how, obviously, you see that with migration flows, with drug trafficking, and other issues. Not just negative, but also positive in terms of trade, in terms of investment. But in terms of challenges, I would divide them first on the issues that are pertaining more directly to Guatemala, like natural disasters, or in a way, organized crime. That I would put it in two sides. One is drug trafficking, and the other one is human smuggling, which, by the way, human smuggling, it's a huge business now. The other day I was reading an article, and they were calculating that the amount of money is about $13 billion a year. Now the coyotes are charging between $10,000 and $15,000, and they're getting more sophisticated. The other day, my consul in one of the frontier towns told me that they caught a plane, I think it was a Learjet, that was full of migrants that was going to travel from that town into the United States. And obviously that was charging more. But one point that I think it's important for the United States has to do with the political landscape in Latin America, how that is changing, and the alliances that are forged as a result of those changes. And I'm here talking about the extra-regional powers that are even more present in the region, particularly China. You mentioned China. China is the largest trading partner for some countries in South America, is the largest foreign direct investor in some countries in Latin America as well. Whereas the United States could be there, but it somehow has been sort of thinking beyond this hemisphere, whereas you were saying correctly, we are your neighbors, not just in terms of geographically, but also in terms of values, principles, and the potential that exists to have a great region. There is one issue that is very important as well, which has to do with the security of the United States, and it's related to Russia, basically. And I don't know if you saw this, but a few months ago, Nicaragua renewed an agreement with Russia. And let me read what that agreement tells. It says, it authorizes Russian troops, planes, and ships to patrol Nicaragua's borders and conduct joint military exercises. That's around the corner. And I don't know if you heard that Iran, Russia, and China were going to conduct military exercises in Venezuela. So I think those are symptoms, in a way, of something that could be in terms of the relationship between the United States and the region. But also has to do with what I was saying before, which is the political landscape. How is this changing in Latin America, where there are being elected governments that are not saying that less friendly to the United States, perhaps some of them are, but they are getting cozier with this other regions. One final point, which I think is very important, and we are suffering in Guatemala, which are cyber attacks. And why we are suffering so much? Because we have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, so China doesn't like us. We have taken the strongest stance against Russia on the war against Ukraine in the international arena. We have been taking the lead to condemn Russia in the Organization of American States, to have them been suspended in their status that they had there. President Yamatei, my president, has been the only Latin American president visiting Zelensky in Ukraine. So we are paying the price for those two relationships. And those are some of the issues that I think the United States should put attention, because at the end of the day, we are the last border. The other day I was jokingly saying that the Darien Gap is no more. I mean, now the strong place to stop is Guatemala, which is a great friend of the United States.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think it's a great start to our conversation, and it tees up Teresa for a discussion of policy very well. We have a survey result from our audience who is saying what they would like you to focus on in your answer. Yeah. But I'm going to give you a really broad question in terms of how do you see U.S. policy affecting the region, and what changes should we make to make more positive impacts?
Sure. I think the ambassador outlined several significant changes in the hemisphere that are directly affecting the United States, and particularly in immigration policy. So if we just want to look at the record number of encounters that we've seen at the U.S.-Mexico border, it's important to understand that this is not the border of 20 years ago. It's not even the border of 10 years ago. So there's three significant changes that we've seen that affect what's happening at the border right now. One is increased economic and political instability in many of the countries in the Western Hemisphere. That is the root causes, that is some of the driving factors. COVID really did wreck a lot of economies in the Western Hemisphere, including economies of countries that had housed a lot of migrants previously. So if we think of the Haitian diaspora and the Haitians that have arrived to the US-Mexico border, a lot of them, in fact, maybe the majority of them, did not come directly from Haiti. They had been previously resettled in Brazil or other countries in South America. But then the economy went south there, and they were no longer able to make a living, so they made their way north. Same with many Venezuelans. They had been resettled in Colombia or other places in Latin America until they found that untenable to stay there, and so they started moving north. So we have to understand that we're looking at a lot of secondary migrations and instability throughout the regions in many countries that is driving not just the migration of their own citizens, but of other nationalities that may have previously found home in there. The second is the change in the migrants themselves and who is coming, the demographics. So we started seeing in 2013 and 2014 the arrival of non-Mexicans, of Central Americans, including families with unaccompanied children and small children. And that has continued, so that family units and unaccompanied children, we also saw a record number of unaccompanied children in the last year at the border, as well as from places, as Kevin said, further away. Why does that matter? Because the way we have set up all of our processes for migrants encountered at the border, our infrastructure, our laws, our regulations, and frankly, our processes of dealing with migrants at the border presumed the vast majority were Mexican. Why does that matter? Well, because Mexicans can be returned to Mexico very quickly under our system. Non-Mexicans cannot without Mexico's acquiescence. So when we started seeing people from other countries than Mexico, we couldn't send them right back to Mexico right away until we negotiated that with Mexico. That created backlogs in our processing facilities along the border, in turn created backlogs in our immigration courts that have only grown and persisted to this day. Now the third factor, again, the ambassador mentioned this, the sophistication of the human smuggling networks throughout the region. And the presence of 150 different nationalities means that the smuggling organizations have successfully advertised around the world that if you want to come into the United States, you come to the US-Mexico border and we'll help you do it, sometimes in comfort via Learjets. That sophistication and the linkages to the transnational criminal organizations, basically diversifying their product lines into human smuggling, is a significant enabler. And they are sophisticated in that they see the changes that we make to our US policy and adapt. Or they see the changes that other countries make to their policies at our behest and adapt, such as when Mexico, at the US urging, required Venezuelans to have visas before coming to Mexico. That did, for a time, decrease the number of Venezuelans we saw at our border, but it meant that they were now coming through much more dangerous routes up through the Darien, up through by land through Mexico. So these three shifts really have created what is, in my mind, on many angles, a crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border. It's a crisis of migration, it's a humanitarian crisis, and it's a law enforcement crisis because our law enforcement agencies at the border are now becoming primarily, first and foremost, migrant caretakers, which is not the roles that they should be doing. And so we need to rethink, I think, a lot of our policies and our procedures and what we want to do at the border to adapt to these shifts. And I will leave it for more to talk about later.
Thank you, Teresa. Huge factor affecting the entire region. That transit process, as the ambassador noted, affecting Guatemala, and we'll talk more about that. But Jonathan, I'd like to go to you. Your company is involved in helping governments with security, transparency throughout the region, from the U.S. border down. I wondered if you could talk about the benefits of applying advanced technology and helping address some of these trends that we talked about.
Yeah, I would maybe pivot away from Teresa's comments on migration and even maybe travel and go back to what the ambassador mentioned on trade specifically. And we all know that some of the same organizations that are helping smuggle migrants are also pushing narcotics, which you talked about at the top of the panel. Through technology, and I think through partnership, country-to-country partnership, the sharing of information, sort of beyond the typical intelligence that has been shared traditionally amongst many countries, is super helpful. And technology platforms like ours sort of allow you to share a much wider data set. I think Administrator Pekoski yesterday talked about One Stop and how that could sort of not only minimize some of the staffing challenges that TSA was having, but also give them a better look. I think we sometimes approach inspections, whether those are at borders or airports, as the first time this thing has ever been looked at, inspected, which is clearly not the case in today's supply chain. So being able to gather that information, being able to take the inspection data, the outbound inspection data, say, for example, from Guatemala, leaving a port, and send that data set, and those things could include, what should be in the container, what did the container look like when it left, what is the x-ray of that container, who drove that container to port, who is that driver, who are they employed by, those sorts of things, sort of a fairly robust data set that may go beyond sort of your typical trade data that CBP would typically ingest. And send that in advance so that CBP can take a look at that before that container arrives, by example. A couple things that does. One, it may not be the one step that TSA is looking at. CBP may not take that outbound inspection as gospel and do nothing else, but it certainly can feed their current risk analysis of that company, those individuals that are involved, that particular commodity, and that sort of thing for some sort of interdiction effort, et cetera. But it also gives them the time and resources to identify then what are they going to inspect, how are they going to inspect it, ultimately making that operation a lot more efficient with the limited resources the CBP is currently facing. In addition, from a port standpoint, both outbound and inbound, it can speed the process. So if you can reduce sort of container transit times, and in most cases from Guatemala, for example, we're talking about green vegetables or green fruit, bananas, et cetera, that even though they're going by sea, an additional 24 hours, additional 48 hours, has a huge impact on what that fruit looks like and how much spoilage it is before it gets to a Whole Foods, for example. So if we can expedite that by 24 hours, 48 hours, and do better interdiction on that and stop fentanyl and other things that can be embedded in those types of shipments, then you're not only improving the market, but significantly improving the capability of the port without billions of dollars of investment in more laydown space, et cetera, et cetera. So it's sort of a self-flicking ice cream cone. These sorts of green trade lanes can be made possible through technology like ours that allow customs to customs sort of receiving or TSA or aviation security experts to receive all the inspection data from its previous logistics chain.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I know just, Ambassador, from hearing President Giammattei talk about the benefits of this type of technology, it's the integrity and transparency of the process, the ability to collect revenue at the national level, to be able to oversee that from a centralized location. It's a really powerful capability. Gary, I'd like to bring you into the conversation here. We're talking about really bringing in new data sources with technology and then understanding what that data means. From my perception, the U.S. intelligence community has a lot to do right now. They're worried about Ukraine-Russia border. They're worried about China, Middle East, Iran's rise. What should companies like yours provide to this fight in terms of using open source data more effectively?
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to be here. So what I just heard the panel talk about, I just took notes, was the transnational criminal organizations and how they're becoming more sophisticated, engaging in smuggling, China increasing instability in the region, economic and political, people coming from further away, and identification of things further from the border before they get here. All of this really is dimensions of human behavior, and humans behave in context. So I've been working, since I left DHS many years ago now, I've been working in technology, and really what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand human behavior, and people are doing taking illicit actions. And the way to do that is to think about human behavior in context. We behave in context, the criminals behave in context. So when we look at government holdings, when we look at intelligence community data, we've got like a soda straw view of human behavior, right? But the people who are engaging in drug trafficking and human trafficking and other illicit activities, they have bigger, broader, more complex lives, just the way each of us do. So what you want to do is you want to take a step back and think wide and broad about data, and that's bringing in publicly available data, publicly available information. There is so much easy information that's publicly available that passes, the privacy filters for government agencies, where you can pick up signals that accomplish all of these goals about understanding what's happening far away from the border before it ever gets close to the border, right? So what I've learned in these years since my time at DHS is that we overemphasize that really, really expensive data that comes in via the intelligence community. It's great data, it's important data, it's very expensive to get, but it's tiny. The largest data sets out there that explain human behavior and who might be engaging in trafficking of any sort is publicly available. From the previous panel, the analogy is the chief was talking about the hotel worker. Had they just noticed that person walking around, they would have known something, some sort of threat existed. The same thing happens in the virtual world as it does in the physical world. You just have to have the data and you just have to notice it. And technology now allows us to do that, right? So the challenge, we've never done this before because the challenge of entity resolution in big, messy, unstructured data has been too hard. It's much better today than it's ever been. So what we need to do is step back and think about human behavior in context. And I think we make massive step function increases in our effectiveness and efficiency. This is happening in other sectors of the economy. It's happening in banking, finding money launderers and human traffickers in banking. It needs to happen in our domain as well.
Thanks, Gary. And I think we heard the CEO of Moonshot talk about it in the domestic violent extremism context yesterday. It's achievable at this point.
It's achievable.
With technology. Ambassador, Steve Francis in the last panel mentioned an effort that I think is pretty impressive in partnership with the Guatemalan government, the transnational criminal investigative units, and really targeting human smuggling earlier in the cycle. I wondered if you could comment on Guatemala's partnership in these areas and what you'd like to see more, both from the U.S. and other regional partners in terms of information sharing and resources to support these types of law enforcement partnerships.
I think that that's key in order to be able to succeed in their fight against organized crime. And one point that it's important is the sharing of information, the sharing of intelligence That is key. Also to have the capabilities in order to be able to combat this effectively. So this is something that we have been discussing with the United States, and we have gotten a lot of support from Homeland Security. Obviously, you remember all the conversations we had when you were at the helm of Homeland Security, but at the end, you have to have a committed partner. And in our case, President Giammattei is very committed on doing this and opening the books, opening everything in order to achieve on that. It is a challenge because of the amount of resources that they have. They operate on impunity, and therefore they like to promote that impunity in our country. So they try to weaken the rule of law in our countries. So we have to work on different issues. One thing is on combating organized crime and all the sources that we have, information, equipment, personnel, and so on and so forth. But then you have to work also on the political side of the equation. So to have political will in order to do that, because as professor of mine used to say, let's take one issue, says in order to address that issue, you need first political will, second political will, third political will, and then you hardware, software, and everything else. And you may confront that in many countries in the Western Hemisphere, and the question is if that political will exists. We have had very great successes. Yesterday, we executed 56 warrants against human traffickers, and about 20 plus people were arrested. A couple of weeks ago, we extradited the first human smugglers to the United States to face justice here. Last year, we broke the all-time record on extraditions for drug traffickers, 63, when the largest number was in 2019, I think it was 21. So we triple that. But that happens through obviously the political will that exists, but also the partnerships that exist between agencies. And it's not just agencies, United States and Guatemala. We also need the Mexicans that are a part of the equation. But we also have to work towards south of the border. And here, one thing that is important in terms of policy in those countries is some of those countries, they give temporary visas. They transit visas for the migrants. They arrive by plane in a certain country, and they just given the transit visas, and they continue going north. So those are the kind of things that we have to work in terms of sharing information, but work towards creating that political will to address the challenges that we have.
Thank you, Ambassador. An impressive effort there. Just yesterday, apparently, not only with the warrants served, but the extraditions. Jonathan, I wonder if you could comment on this, because what strikes me from the ambassador's point is not only the power of that partnership, but the power of presence in these countries. From my perspective, that's how we assert our role in the hemisphere as well, vis-a-vis China, by being present, and it's what's worked in addressing these types of flows, actually in partnership from a law enforcement perspective. But you've achieved it from a security company's perspective. A lot of companies are maybe daunted by working in the region that have established capability in North America or in Europe. How are you able to build those public-private partnerships in the region and really have that presence of a highly capable U.S.-based company partnering with governments throughout the Americas?
Yeah, thanks for that. We've been fortunate, I think, in that there have been challenges certainly in the region to step up, particularly if we're talking about sort of border interdiction, border screening, port screening, airport security, and the like. The acquisition of technology to do those things, the integration effort that takes, the training, the staffing to do those sorts of activities. And so a lot of countries in that region are going to, from very little capability and trying to achieve a very high level of capability. That's not inexpensive. As a result of that, and as a result of maybe the U.S. policy in what they were investing in and where those investment dollars were going, the Chinese did come in that vacuum and started investing heavily in this sector and deploying Chinese technology at very either no money or very low and cheap loans, with some know-how, training, and capability. We, I guess from a company perspective, thought that we could approach these same customers, these same governments, with a sort of an investment on our part. We'll invest in providing you this full technology suite, to include operational capabilities in some cases. In some countries, we operate the technology on their behalf. In some countries, we've been identified as sort of contracted customs officials so that we could have the legal authority to do some of the interdictions that we were doing, and invested in that country so that they could then sort of pivot to user fees and collect user fees based on that to end up getting our, the investment that we made, our return. So we found that to be very helpful. Now we're doing it in a couple different ways. Now, oftentimes with some money that is being provided by the US government, a country can get a foothold of a capability. We can come in and layer on that, and they can continue sort of the maintenance operation and cost of continuing that security posture through user fees also. So it's sort of a investment from a private sector willing to take some risks with some foreign governments, which we've done sort of for the last decade and worked with a lot of countries within the Western Hemisphere and further out. It's been successful for us, and ultimately very successful programs, which I think has culminated in some level of trust, country to country, some level of trust between customs organizations, and inevitably this sharing of information that they'd never shared before.
Thanks, Jonathan. Teresa, it strikes me at Bipartisan Policy Center. It's a great word, especially 40 miles outside of Washington. In my experience, there was actually a lot of bipartisan agreement on engagement in the region, especially on security partnerships. That conversation seems to have been overcome by policy differences on what's happening at the border that you outlined. Yeah. Is there an opportunity to find and forge some bipartisan support for the type of engagement that the ambassador and Jonathan have talked about?
I think there are. I mean, there obviously are challenges, especially when it comes to immigration. It's one of the most polarizing political issues in the United States. But one of the things I think we need to understand, this goes to something that my colleague over here talked about, like everyone, including migrants, operate in a context. So one of the things that we focus a whole lot politically on the United States is what's our US policy on immigration and how will that affect migration? And I think we have to kind of take a step back and understand that migrants make a lot of decisions before they think about what our policy is. Their very first decision is, do I have to leave where I am? Why do I have to leave? How important is it that I leave? That's the first decision they make. Then it's, if I'm going to leave, how do I leave and where do I go? Well, that's the enablers. And right now, that decision is being enabled by criminal organizations who have a money-making incentive to, frankly, lie to them about our policy. So if we want to tackle what's happening, take a step back from the border, yes, there's things we could do differently at the border. There's US policies that could make a little bit of a difference. But I think we need to take a step back and think about what can we do before the migrants get to the border. I'm not talking about root causes, investment, and development. Like, yes, we should be more engaged in our hemisphere on a foreign policy basis. That's a long-term strategy that may impact some of these things in a long term. But if we want to affect migration, I think the number one thing we can do is what we are doing with Guatemala and other countries. Go after the enablers. Go after those criminal smuggling organizations, because that's what's driving the numbers. That's what's driving the routes. That's what's driving why Venezuelans were going to West Texas and Eastern Arizona rather than South Texas, why Ukrainians ended up in San Diego. Like, that's what's driving that. So if we want to be responsive and have more information, how can we, one, pay attention to what migrants are saying before they migrate, and two, go after the enabling organizations that are facilitating it.
Gary, you want to chime in?
Yeah, can I just add? So the best case study of this, and it goes back a little bit to when we were all in government, but in 2005, we had the catch and release issue where we were apprehending more people than we could detain, right? So, and Secretary Chertoff tapped me on the shoulder to co-lead a working group to address the, how to end catch and release in 2005. The initial reaction was, well, we're apprehending more people, but we can't detain them. Well, let's build more detention space, which is absolutely the wrong way to think about it. The way to think about it is exactly what Teresa just said. What we did is through partnerships, we made it so that the smuggling organizations made no money by bringing people across the border, and then the flow dropped within 60 to 90 days, right? So the problem isn't how do you apprehend and detain more people. The problem is how do you make it a bad business model to smuggle people to begin with?
Yep.
Go after the businesses. Transnational criminal organizations are firms. They're companies. They need revenues to exceed costs, otherwise they're not going to do it. You go after that. That's what we did, and it worked. It worked within 90 days. It was amazing. I think that's the great case study of what Teresa's talking about is think about why are people doing this and go after the business model.
May I jump in
Yes.
here? Because I think that that's a key point, and that's what we are trying to do, disrupt their business model, which is a hugely profitable business. $13 billion a year is huge. One thing that we have done in Guatemala is we beefed up the capacity of the Attorney General's office to go after them. We have a special set of police force devoted to this. We amended our criminal law so that penalties against human smugglers were increased up to 50 years in prison. So there are things that you could do, but a single country alone would not make it. I mean, it has to be something that works along the route to get to the United States.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think that's a good point to pause and see if our audience would like to ask some direct questions. I certainly have more if you don't want to chime in, but I'm guessing, given this group, you have some questions for our panel. Please. Long microphone walk, but we see you.
Thanks very much to the entire panel. Question basically to Teresa, but then going on from there. You point out very correctly that misinformation on the part of our adversaries in these regards has led many of the most victimized people to do the wrong thing, to have the wrong conclusions about it. What type of messaging can we do in terms of the government, in terms of the media, to countermand that misinformation? Is there some types of policies that can be developed towards proper information as opposed to the path that they're being led down?
I will tell you that I don't believe that particularly U.S. government messengers are all that influential to migrants. That's not who they listen to. They listen to their families, their fellow migrants. The rumor mills are insatiable on, the text messaging apps and Facebook groups. And again, the smugglers are in those groups as well, kind of saying, the Biden administration is going to welcome you with open arms, even though the Biden administration didn't make fundamental changes to most migrants at the border for many months after they came in. Or when Trump came in office, that, Trump's going to crack down, so you better come before he cracks down, right? It doesn't matter what we say. They're going to twist it to enable their what they want to say to enable the migrants to come. I think that messaging it's something that governments feel like they have to do, but I don't think we have seen that it's that effective. I think what really matters is if we do change policy, but more importantly, what other countries in the hemisphere do to change their policies. If we're just trying to address this at our border, that is the last place that it works. Yeah. We do need to address what happens to migrants after they arrive, the backlogs in our adjudication system that mean essentially we have no effective way to decide whether people can stay or not until years after they've been in the United States. That's ineffectual. That doesn't make a difference. We need to fix that. But also, as the ambassador noted, countries in the region that feel like, I don't want this migration problem to be mine, so I'll give everybody transit visas and wave them through, That's not helpful either. And last but not least, I think, if you ask me right now who's managing U.S. migration policy at the border, I'd say number one, it's the U.S. courts, because for the last 3 administrations, efforts that they have tried to tackle the border, they have ended up in court. And so it doesn't matter which party, somebody's going to sue you, and the courts will decide what you can and can't do at the border, and that can result in rapid changes in our policies, which is not helpful. 2, Mexico. We are heavily reliant right now on who Mexico will agree to take back, and how many. And whether it's families or kids or adults or whoever, that's huge. And then from there, all the other countries along the migration routes. So messaging is something that we all want to try to address, but just like addressing misinformation in the United States, that is a much larger set of issues. I think we need to focus on what these other things are that we can do.
Could I follow up, please, with regard to that, Teresa, and to the other panel members? Yeah, unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish. If I did, I would like to know the phrase. I'm here from the government, and I'm here to help. But the real question becomes, is there not a means of organizing non-governmental organizations and other entities out there in cooperation with our government, in cooperation with the government of Guatemala, in cooperation with the government of Mexico, to bring those messages to the people who need them, so that the families, for instance, will have the straight scoop as opposed to giving what is their best guess or what they're being misinformed about?
I think there have been efforts underway. I know the U.S. government has tried to work through NGOs in the regions, particularly local organizations, but I think they're up against a lot, and to try to break through on that. Like I said, I think it's something that's necessary but not sufficient to manage things better.
Just to add, I think that's a valid idea. But in the short term, the easy step is just to listen. So if you go back into this world of public information, you can see who's saying what to whom. You can start to see where the next group is going to come from, who's saying what are the paths and channels. I just think we need to do a much better job of stepping back and looking what's already publicly available, look at the message that is being told by the smugglers to the folks who might want to come here. And I think we can step up our game there pretty quickly.
And with that, we're past time. Thank you for the good question, great answers, team. Really appreciate this panel. Thank you so much for being here and for your expertise and for what you do. So thank you very much.